And if you have any interest in cannabis policy reform, add your name to our mailing list. We do not sell our mailing list, we keep it confidential, but we will be sending you updates on cannabis policy reform and so forth. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce to you one of the genuine rock stars of Canadian drug policy reform movement, all the way from Abbotsford, British Columbia. And before I introduce him by name, I'll just give you a little story. A couple of years ago, I was in a previous job, and our next speaker and myself were in testimony before the Senate of Canada in Ottawa. We were talking with the Senate about Bill C-25, which was mandatory minimums, I believe. We were making the case that mandatory minimum sentences were a bad idea. And you gotta put yourself in this situation to appreciate how absurd it is talking to these guys. Because they're really not interested in the evidence, they're only interested in the politics. And at one point, our next speaker told a little story about a conversation he'd had with a Reform Party member in British Columbia who wanted to bring back the prohibition of alcohol. And our next speaker said he thought that was a great idea because he's made a fortune off the prohibition of drugs. Please welcome John Conroy.
Thank you. Thank you. That on? Well, I'm supposed to do closing remarks, but I have realized that there's actually still some things that are going to go on afterwards. But my schedule, I'm afraid, required me to make sure that I try to speak to you in here. So by way of closing remarks, they've slotted me about a half an hour, which is a reasonably long time to make closing remarks. I hope many of you have appreciated the various speakers that we've had over the last few days, and we'll support NORML Canada so we can keep doing this in order to educate the public in terms of this whole issue. As we discussed yesterday, you heard from Alan Young, who was the Vice President of NORML. We go back to those early days when it was George Baker, who was a Canadian dual citizen, actually. No, sorry, he was an American citizen who had ended up involved in a drug bust here in Canada. And he and others came out to see me and asked us to get involved in helping to legalize marijuana. And that was back in about 1974, 75. And we used to have meetings around my kitchen table of the few lawyers that got involved from Vancouver. Clay Ruby from Toronto was part of our board back in those days. And of course, in those days, people went to prison for simple possession of marijuana. So there were a lot of people who were energized and active and ready to help and contribute funds, and NORML was a much more thriving organization. Keith Stroop, those of you who heard him yesterday, we had to get in touch with Keith. NORML had only been going a year or so in the United States at the time, and so we got permission to use that name in order to create NORML Canada, because it was our consensus that notwithstanding having protests and all of those sorts of things, we needed to have a legal organization that was legal in Canada in order to move the agenda along to try and achieve legalization. And so we had rallies, we had fundraisers and all the rest of it, and everybody was quite active at the time. And we had, over those years, many promises that politicians were going to do the right thing and were going to change the law once they got into power. And various types of things were floated out there, using the Contraventions Act federally, moving it to the Food and Drug Act. Decriminalization was the word that people then used in order to eliminate criminal penalties. That was the incremental steps that we thought should take place. So here we are, 40 plus years later, And as I said yesterday, my motto over the recent years had become, there is no one more furiously cynical than an idealist betrayed, based upon my experiences and what was not happening and hadn't yet happened over these 40 years. But I'm pleased to say that I am re-energized by groups like this when we're able to get together and we're able to share our experiences and realize that we are, as Alan and others said yesterday, in a historical situation that we need to all focus on and take advantage of and concentrate on. We have an opportunity to legalize marijuana that we haven't had in the past. We have politicians who are prepared to use the word legalization. Never prepared to use that before. And we have politicians who are able to not only stand up and use that word, but when they're questioned, they're able to give the right answers. You know, oh, what about the message to our kids? What's our children going to think? Your children are your responsibility, and you should stop abdicating your responsibility to the criminal justice system, for one. For two, your children are surely going to go to school and meet other children, and in the result, they're going to find out just where to go and get not just cannabis, but any other drug they want down at the local park or at the SkyTrain station or you name it. When are these people going to understand that prohibition is an out-of-control situation? Regulation is the only policy option that brings it into control. If you want to regulate what your kids do or don't do, or the age limit thing, you need regulations, and you need responsible parenting. You need to talk to your kids. You need to look up the stuff about it instead of just gut reacting to the emotional bullshit that you see in the newspapers. You know, the brain damage thing. Well, God, I don't know how many times I've heard this come up. Fortunately, I know a guy called Paul Armentano from NORML USA, and every time anything like that comes up, he sends me all of the stuff to put it in context. Remember, when you read stuff in the media, don't blame the media. The media is just doing what you want. They're supplying you with stories, and they have to be unusual and exceptional stories, or you wouldn't read the newspaper, you turn off the television. So remember, those are unusual stories. They're designed to get you up and going, and you need to stop and use your heads and wait a minute, let's just think about this. If there are all these brain damage problems, where are they? Where are all these brain damaged kids? You know, it's just total nonsense. One of my favorite stories that shows that we've come to the mainstream, and by the way, I heard that Dr. Oz was now on board. You know, Sanjay Gupta, Dr. Oz, isn't that mainstream? I mean, when Sanjay Gupta, with his role with CNN, gets on and says, I made a mistake, I apologize. I mean, that's pretty powerful stuff. And so, you know, we're in the mainstream. Dayton, Ohio has a newspaper, and they said, okay, things are moving along in the United States. We're going to have somebody on our staff write at the pro-prohibition side and somebody do the anti-prohibition side. They couldn't find anybody on the staff to support prohibition anymore. This is a newspaper. They couldn't find anybody to support it. So what did they do? They printed the newspaper with one whole side blank. Well, those in favor of prohibition, nothing to say. And then a huge page with all of the arguments against prohibition. And, you know, that's the important thing. Don't get sucked in to it's a good drug, it's a bad drug, and so on. It's really about policy, the government policy. They've got two options. One of them is prohibition, and the other is regulation. And I'm talking about when you're selling anything to the public. There's always going to be regulation. So you have to be very clear that prohibition drives things underground, creates illicit markets. When you have illicit markets, you can't call the police when somebody rips you off. Medical growers who are licensed, Call the police when somebody tries to rip them off. Have security in place to try and prevent these things. You know, so you drive it underground, you create violence. How absurd is that? You've got a marijuana which has no lethal dose, no LD50 as the doctors say, but we're going to use a policy where we know people want marijuana and we're going to let them shoot each other when they have disputes and so on, instead of creating a legal market. How stupid is that? You know, this is what the Conservative government supports. Oh, wait a minute, I digress. They've actually waffled a little bit lately, haven't they? Because they realized that they can get votes from you guys. So don't get sucked in. You know, the traffic ticket thing. Oh, well, we'll just let the police do the traffic ticket thing. So, what is the biggest complaint that people have about the police? It's usually because of interacting over traffic ticket types of things. So they will interfere more with your civil liberties by that type of a decriminalization approach. Don't buy it. We have to, the number one thing between now and next October is to get everybody you know out to vote. Don't give me this bull about your vote doesn't count that I heard earlier on. Your vote does count. The only reason the Conservatives are in power is because people didn't go out to vote, you know? Number one, get out and vote. Get all your friends to get out and vote. Dana Larson said an interesting thing here. He said the people coming up to him in his Sensible BC were people my age, maybe a little younger, but not the young people. We need the young people whose choice of drug is primarily cannabis, I understand. They've got to get out and vote. They have to understand we need their votes, and they have to vote against the Conservatives, against Harper if he's still there, but if he isn't there, whoever it is, we have to vote against them. Now, the only party that's supporting legalization is the Liberal Party of Canada. Their Mulcair for the NDP, much to my dismay, is simply trotting out the old decriminalization. It's just not good enough. It doesn't, you know, it's more of the same old stuff. We need to get cannabis out of Schedule II of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act so that it is no longer a criminal law issue. And that's important because the feds control criminal law. And as long as it's under criminal law, their constitutional power, then we have all these other problems about how you regulate medical and so on in terms of with this criminal law power hanging over our heads. It makes it that much more difficult. So we need to legalize. Zoomer magazine, a magazine that caters to people younger than me and older than me, has supported cannabis legalization and regulation as opposed to prohibition. They represent my cohort, but we need that young cohort in there too. We need everybody to vote and vote for the Liberal Party of Canada as the only party that is supporting legalization. Now, if in your riding you think that you're throwing your vote away because the NDP is going to get in, and it's a fight between the Conservative and the NDP, well, you might, in those exceptional circumstances, vote for the NDP, remembering that your vote is a strategic vote to stop the Conservatives. As Dan Mulligan said yesterday, there's no such thing as a progressive Conservative anymore. They're all totally off the map, right wing. It's ridiculous what we're faced with. Anyway, so that is the most important thing, is getting out to vote and focusing on the federal election so we can get these people out of power, get it removed from Schedule II, and then we have a situation where the feds are clearly going to be involved in terms of import, export, various other things where federal regulation are always going to be in, but the provinces are the ones that have to step up to the plate, and we have to see a set of provincial regulations that deal with the issues of distribution and retail. The whole business about age limit came up. I just wanted to make a point about that. we treat people as adults in the criminal justice system when they turn 17. And so that's something I think you need to consider in this debate between whether it should be 16 or 19. I'm inclined to agree with Eugene, who said 19 is the only realistic political thing at the moment. I think that's true. But we need to remember, and especially when they trot out the brain stuff, you say, well, when can they join the army? When do you send them off to war? That's before 19, isn't it? How's that going to impact their brains? You know, what about all the other things that happen in this world that impact young people's brains as they grow up? You know? I mean, it's just, you got to remember when you hear these stories, folks. They're just trying to get more gut reactions, sell more papers, so you have to start always remembering that and reaching out for the tons of information that's out there. A word about another issue that's important in terms of where we're going and what we're doing. Keith talked about, you know, what he's finding and what others are finding in terms of us trying to move ahead is that we're catering now not to the converted, we're getting the mainstream, the people who support us even though they're not involved with cannabis. And so the children thing and what happens to your children, you need to be able to speak to that. You need to be able to, you know, repeat, look, the message you're sending to your children is go down the park and get it from some underground dealer with no quality or controls or anything, and if he thinks you're ripping him off, your kid might get stabbed. That's for your children? Give me a break. Okay, so get really informed and work on that one so you can answer people on that one. The other one is the DUI, the impaired driving. As has been said now a number of times, Canada's law is thou shalt not drive while your ability to do so is impaired by alcohol or a drug. The way that the police have enforced that law since ever I've been practicing, which is more than 40 years, is they see erratic driving or they smell alcohol at a roadblock, they ask you to step out of the vehicle, they make you do roadside tests that they're all trained to do, and they determine whether your ability to drive is impaired by alcohol or a drug. They test your motor coordination skills. There's no magic box that you blow into that gives a nanogram level that shows that you're impaired. Washington State and Colorado have unfortunately gone that route, but for political reasons. They had to get the support of the US law enforcement community, and the only way they were going to get it in Washington State was to agree to have a per se impaired law, which means that when you are over 5 nanograms, you're presumed to be impaired. That's not what we want here, and that's wrong. And particularly wrong because of the medical patients who will blow over 5 nanograms any day of the week and will not be impaired. And so it's important that we speak to people and make them understand we're alive to the impaired driving issue. It's been enforced in relation to alcohol and drugs for ages, and it's not a problem. And what I said the other day, you may as well require the officer to videotape what goes on and have a presumption against their testimony if they don't, so that we'll eliminate disputes about what really happened on those roadside tests. So impaired driving and the children issue, in my view, is a big thing. The third one that I would say that you need to always be ready to answer in order to convince people that this is what we need to do is the stepping stone theory, that marijuana is a stepping stone to other drugs. Well, if you go into a bar and they offer all kinds of different things, you may try all the different things. So if you go to some illicit dealer and the illicit dealer says, oh, why don't you try a little cocaine this time instead of the marijuana? Well, to that extent, just like any store, you may be tempted by the different things that are available, but there's nothing in marijuana that causes you to go and move to some other drug. The interesting thing is, and I've found this out more and more, originally from the compassion clubs, but now particularly under the medical program, there are literally hundreds, thousands, I can say, of Canadian people who are on hard drugs, all kinds of pharmaceuticals. You look at the photographs of all the pill boxes that they have, and they have managed to get rid of all of them. They don't do any of them anymore. The stepping stone is towards better control over your health without all of these pharmaceuticals, without all of the side effects, and without all of the huge costs that they too have, so that you're down to one drug that seems to work for a huge number of people. So it's a stepping the other way, or if they talk about it as the gate opens and closes, and the gate also heads into a better direction. So I've tried to focus on the topics that have come up over time. I know we're running behind, and so I'm trying to keep this down to a certain extent, but I keep coming back to the #1 priority, because if we do elect a liberal government that legalizes, and I agree with the earlier comments too, we need to hold their feet to the fire to make sure they do it. And Kirk said 5 years. Hey, he's too young. He hasn't been around long enough. 1 year after they're elected, what does it take to to remove marijuana from the schedule to the, you don't need to have a big debate in Parliament, you just take it out of the schedule, that's all you have to do. You know, so the big thing is, what are we going to have in place? So you had some great discussion here this afternoon about the models. We've got California that's thinking of things. We've got the examples in Washington State and Colorado to look at. We need to have a good model that fits within our Canadian constitutional structure and get towards legalization. And when you have legalization, then in my view, what you do, growing a plant at home or whatever, unless you're going to somehow impact upon others, is none of the government's business. It is a bit of a hybrid, because if you're in an apartment and you're growing plants for yourself, for your own personal use, you may impact upon others. And when I was doing the cross-examinations with Health Canada, one of the things was they had this huge stack of papers of people filing complaints about smell. And I said, well, what do you do about that? Did you contact them and tell them how to get rid of the smell? It's not Health Canada's jurisdiction to control smell, they said. So, you know, but if you're growing and you're causing a smell for your neighbors, you are hurting the cause. You are not helping us. You are making it more difficult for us. Those people don't smoke marijuana. The people we want on our side are the people who don't smoke marijuana. We need them to win the election. Think of them. Think of how you're an ambassador to all of those folks out there who are not involved in this movement. We need them to win this legalization. And in my view, Kirk, 1 year, not 5 years. So, let me wrap up then, because I know there's a lot more to go. That's the most important thing. We've still got the court case going on, and we've got this whole schedule leading up to next February. We've got a ton of things that we have to do between now and then. My hope is that while we are doing the medical case, that there's an election on, that all of you who have stories to tell, especially medical stories, will speak to the media and speak to the public and tell the public your stories. Because it's those stories that convince people who are not involved in marijuana. When they hear about how it's helped some person like Michaela or any of the other people, when they see the Gupta show and learn about Dravet syndrome and how it helped these young people, you know, those are the stories that cause people who have never thought much about marijuana or have thought bad things about marijuana, that causes them to stop and scratch their heads and say, why do I want to oppose this if this helps somebody? So tell the stories. Let's either join the Liberal Party or hold your nose if you don't like the Liberals and vote for them, or vote for the NDP only if it's a way to beat the Conservatives. But that has to be our primary focus. Please join NORML Canada, contribute money to NORML Canada. NORML Canada is the brand. If you ask at least people my age what came out of the 60s and 70s, they'd say High Times and NORML. And those are the brands. It's about using the brand that calls for legalization. So help, you know, we need not just supporting political parties, but the party or the group that's prepared to hold out for legalization and look at the models and try and assist in having that come true. In the meantime, we have the Coalition Against Repeal and other groups trying to help raise funds for us to continue fighting the medical case. And as I say, I think the evidence in the medical case and the evidence from outside the medical case is very, very important in terms of educating Canadian members of the public to get out there and vote for legalization in 2015. Thank you very much.